Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Beyond the To-Do List. This is the show where I, Eric Fisher, your host, talk to the people behind the productivity. We talk not just about how to be more efficient and effective, but how to do life and work with meaning and purpose. This week, I have two guests at the same time. I thought I would do something a little bit different and pick a specific project and walk with those creators from the idea and the inception of that idea through to the planning and the execution, as well as the when do you decide something's fully done, and even how do you put it out there and market it and decide what that project is for. And this goes for not just creative projects, but also business type projects as well. You get that idea where it's, a business project where you walk a complete idea straight through, as well as if you're creating a work of art, if you will. The project is a podcast called The Podcast Producers, which you can find at thepodcastproducers.com. And the guests are Jessica Rhodes and Corey Coates. Each of them have been involved with podcasting and audio content producing for a while now and are huge podcast fans. And seeing as this is a podcast that you're listening to, I thought, as a listener, you might be forgiving of walking through a specific project that is a podcast that honestly, I think is worth your listen. In fact, I am one of the many guests on this podcast, which consists of 10 episodes. That's right. You can listen to the whole thing like I did even on a road trip over the course of a few hours. And I really enjoyed it. In fact, like I say in the episode, I got back to it, listening to it, and forgot I had said some of the stuff and said, wow, you guys really tied a great narrative together, telling the story through all these different voices, and you made me sound smart. And so if you can do that, then, you must know what you're doing. So anyway, I hope you enjoy this behind the scenes look at The Podcast Producers with Jessica Rhodes and Corey Coates. And I hope you check that podcast out because it's really cool. 10 episodes. Again, you can find that at thepodcastproducers.com. And as I promised, I want to give you a quick lynda.com course selection recommendation. And in fact, I'm going to give you 3. It's a 3B. It's not a freebie. It's a 3B. If you're not familiar with lynda.com, you can check them out at lynda.com/todo. That's TODO. And yes, that's an affiliate link that helps support this podcast. Lynda.com has tons, like literally tons. I don't know how much digital stuff weighs, but whatever. Probably the weight of the servers that holds it. But Lynda.com has online video training tutorials, and it's not course by course that you pay for it, which is the genius thing about this setup is you do a monthly payment, you get in, you can consume, you can experience, you can learn as many sessions as you want to. You can even take those to go on your digital mobile devices of all sorts. It's awesome. I've been using it for a long time now to really round out my education. Seeing as this is an episode dedicated to podcasting and creating podcasts, the love of podcasts, enjoying podcasts, lynda.com has more than 3 different courses on each of the major audio editing platforms. They've got ones on the free stuff like Audacity and GarageBand that comes built into your Mac. It also has Adobe Audition. So if you're looking to get started with podcasting or get better at podcast editing, those are the courses you need to go check out. Again, go to lynda, lynda.com/TODO to help support this show. You get a free trial of Lynda, and you can go in and you can pretty much consume at least a course or 2, if not more, in a week and learn for free and get hooked like I did. Go check it out. Lynda, lynda.com/TODO. This week is a little bit unique. I get to welcome Jessica Rhodes and Corey Coates. Welcome, guys.
Hey.
Hey, Eric.
And I hope you can tell by the names and the voices which is which.
I'm Jessica.
Corey.
Yes. Jessica's got this really deep voice. And you guys are playing around in the space here, podcasting space, and I want to start by giving some context to this thesis idea I had once I concluded listening to your project, which was the podcast producers. Before we describe that a little bit, I want to give a little more context to who you are and what you do as far as podcasting goes. So, ladies first.
Okay. Well, as you all probably know, I'm Jessica, not Corey. And I am the founder of interviewconnections.com, and we're the premier source for booking outstanding podcast guests. So for several years now, I have been working in the podcasting community, finding and booking guests. So just being a master connector and networker and building lots of relationships within podcasting, and actually started my own show back in the fall of 2014. So I've actually been a podcaster myself just over 6 months now. But when I then created the podcast producers with Corey, I feel like I got a crash course and have quickly become a veteran podcaster with all the interviews that we did for that show. So that's just a little bit about kind of who I am in the podcasting space.
Before that, though, you were huge into podcasts, and you kind of got that from your husband, right?
Yeah, it's funny because I was talking to Elsie Escobar at New Media Expo, and I had this light bulb moment where I realized, so the story I told on the show is that I really got into podcasts because of my husband. He's a big NPR junkie and always has NPR in the car. And so we listened to a lot of podcasts together. But I realized as I was talking to Elsie that actually the first time that I discovered podcasts was when I was on iTunes searching for yoga classes. And I'm like, I need to go back and re-record the podcast producers, because that is actually when I kind of made the connection of podcasts, because I wanted to, I was doing yoga in my apartment. And of course I had like all these yoga DVDs. And as I'm searching iTunes, I was seeing all these yoga video podcasts for free. And I'm like, I've been spending $20 on DVDs. This is like, I feel like can you believe nobody buys DVDs anymore? I'm only going back like 4 years.
Right.
So I'm like I'm buying, yoga DVDs at Target, and here they are for free on iTunes. And I'm like, podcasts? Like they're free? So that's kind of like a little bit of an update, because I didn't talk about that in the show, because I didn't remember till I'm talking to Elsie of Elsie's yoga class. So yeah, it was a whole new world was opened up. And I mean, that was several years before I even started my business and got into podcasting as an entrepreneur.
Interesting. Corey, what about you? How did you get interested in podcasting as well as to the point of working in podcasting?
Way back in the day, I was a huge fan of Leo Laporte and the Screensavers and all that kind of geek TV. And back in 2004, he introduced Twit, his first kind of podcast. And I'd been listening to his radio shows as well, so I was a kind of a big fan of his work. But when I discovered podcasting and, through Leo and his network, I realized, my goodness, this is actually a great medium for just about anybody to jump onto. I was running a project music recording studio at the time, and I had a teaching practice as well. I was a professional musician and an engineer. And I thought this is a great way to get together with some friends, talk about independent music, and start spinning some independent music in a podcast form. So I think it was about 2005, 2006, released our first episode of a very popular independent podcast, right around the time that I think iTunes, integrated podcasts into that platform. So we became popular really, really quick. We had, 10,000, 20,000 downloads per episode in a time when there was maybe only, I think, like 100,000 listeners in the sphere. And then from there, I was just hooked, doing some talk radio shows, transferring them over to podcasting. I really have never stopped until recently, where I felt like, gosh, maybe I should step back a little bit and do more of a meta program about podcasting itself. So I've been kind of in the game, Eric, for maybe about 8 years now.
That's interesting. I know that my story kind of coincides with that, where I didn't know what a podcast was, didn't have any kind of interest whatsoever. I was doing a data entry job, sitting there all day typing away, and had my iTunes playing. And suddenly I see, a pop-up on this old archival Windows machine saying iTunes has an update. And this was June of 2005. I don't know the exact date, but that means we're basically coming up on 10 years of podcasting inside iTunes right now, currently. Yeah. And that was it for me. I came back from my quick bathroom break while it updated, and I was like, what's this thing called podcasts over here? And I started clicking through, and I'm like, Oh, it's audio shows. It's June 28th. I had to scroll through Wikipedia for a second. So June 28th, 2005, iTunes 4.9 added built-in support for podcasts. There it is.
Wow.
So, yeah, we're coming up on, in a month we'll be there. It's crazy.
I wish we could. Gosh, I really wish that we could say we created the podcast producers as a 10-year anniversary of podcasting. That would be.
You can always go back and re-edit those files and replace them. So let's talk about this. Okay, so we're all huge podcasting fans. We're also all doing podcasts. We love podcasts. We're connecting and networking with podcasters. But what was the inception of this idea of doing a serialized story about podcasting itself called The Podcast Producers?
I felt like at the end of last year, I discontinued some of my podcasts because I was really focusing a lot of my attention on producing content for my clients. And at that time, I thought maybe I should do something because I missed being on mic. I really missed putting these things together. And I remembered about maybe 2.5 years earlier, I was asked to do a pilot episode of a program for NPR down in Central America. And that show was called Contrabandas, right? So it was basically a program that was going to be 7 Central American countries focusing on 7 bands in each of those countries. And after doing that sort of pilot and putting that together, I realized that this is an amazing format. It's a good way to kind of step back and do it, serialized as a story that you're telling, and then narrate the story and then inject your own opinion, your own angle on everything, but do it in a way that I think presents it, so it's very palatable to a listener over a long period of time. And when I was looking at doing a new podcast, I thought I should do something related to the podcast space, just to kind of increase my visibility within this market. And it really came to me. It's like I talk to amazing podcasters every single day, be them new clients that I'm bringing on or just people within the industry or even just Facebook chats and conversations. And I felt like, these guys are telling amazing stories that aren't really being well conveyed in their own programs because they're too busy. They're in broadcast mode. They're on their own content. But I want to get kind of behind the scenes and learn more about them. So the idea was, how can I present these podcast producers in a light to people who are maybe new to podcasting or seasoned podcasters that kind of makes it a little bit more human, something a little more, easier to digest. It's more relatable to folks. So that was kind of the idea. It's like, I better create a podcast that has something to do with podcasting, but I really didn't want to do it in a way that was going to be, this long form, never ending interview format. That is, a great way to go for those that have that, long tail form. But for me, it was more like, I got to find a way to package this and present it to people. And at the same time, I was watching like House of Cards and I was just binging on all these Netflix shows. And I thought maybe there's a great way to combine all of this. And of course, Jessica came up with the idea. It's like, why don't we just make it 10 shows and just release them all at once?
Okay. So then how does Jessica enter into this further formation of the idea?
I couldn't do it alone. There was just no way. I felt like I can do it by myself, but it's going to be, just a very, I don't know. I didn't have a full perspective of podcasting that I think somebody else could bring to the picture. And I'd been working with Jessica. She'd been booking a lot of guests on some of my clients' guests, that sort of thing. And
Gotcha.
we got together, I don't know, Jessica, maybe a year ago or something.
No, not even, because I just hired. I'm a client of Corey's at Podfly, and I use Podfly for my podcast. So I've only known you, Corey, since, I don't know, September of 2014.
We've been through wars together. That's incredible.
I know, right? I feel like I've known you forever, but we just, a mutual client of ours connected us. And at that time, I was getting ready to start my podcast. I don't even think Corey realized that. It was like just very perfect timing. And he just wanted to, I think Corey just called me because he had a lot of clients that were, booking guests and things like that. And meanwhile, I'm getting ready to start my podcast. Basically didn't even know how to open up GarageBand, let alone edit a show. And so I just learned what he did and I hired Podfly immediately. And so that's kind of how we got started. But then we, we're fast friends just because we kind of have a similar philosophies around podcasting and business and stuff like that. Yeah. And then Corey came to me, several months later. So why the heck he wanted me to co-host it with him? You got me, but I'm.
Well,
I think it was twofold. It was one, like Jessica's obviously an expert at booking guests and has a lot of those connections already established with people that I thought might be appropriate for the show. And second, Jessica's an awesome podcaster. She's really good at interviewing people. She can get, an interview guest very comfortable immediately and start talking about things that isn't normally their boilerplate answers. So I pitched it to her. I said, I think we've got something here. I think I've got a beginning and an end. And I actually put together a proper pitch proposal and sent it over to Jessica and crossed my fingers and said, I hope she's on board with this because I think she'd be perfect for it.
I was really flattered by that, honestly, because, as mentioned, I had only been podcasting myself for a few months. So to be recognized as someone that was good at it was very flattering. And so, when Corey emailed me about that, I, took the time to kind of review what he said. He sent me a link to the pilot that he had done for NPR a few years back. And I'm like, oh my gosh, this is good stuff. It was very, very high quality content. And so then from there, we just had a conversation around, okay, what would this all look like? And having it be a 10 episode series, saying that there would be an end date was really, important. It was important for me just because, when you go into any type of business partnership or co-hosting a show together, you just want to make sure that you don't ruin the relationship in any way, that there, nothing bad happens. So for us, we laid out like what each other's responsibilities were going to be, start and end and all that stuff before we both said, okay, let's do this.
A lot of people, when they first start a new project, even if it's in their field already, they have that doubt of, can I really pull this off? Is this really the right thing to do? Did you have those, those doubts come in as you were planning and starting?
Well, for me, I think the key is having low expectations.
Oh, my.
Let me explain.
You exceeded those.
I think basically Corey and I brought very complementary skill sets and attitudes and personalities to this project. This really was, and I keep saying it is Corey's brainchild. It was his initial idea, and then he, invited me to take part in it. It has become a project that we created together. But he brings a lot of the passion around producing a show because he did all the post-production and the editing and everything. So he brought a lot of the passion, and I brought a little bit more of like the marketing. And does this make sense for business? Because as much as this did really become a part hobby, part business venture, I started saying like, this has to make sense for me to spend a lot of time on because, I'm running a business. I've got a 2-year-old. I'm pregnant right now. Like I just didn't have a lot of time to create a whole show that wasn't going to produce a return on investment in some way. So I really let him know that, all right, this podcast has to make sense for me and my business in some way. So I actually forget the initial question, but that's kind of what we both kind of brought in complementary viewpoints. Like I think Corey, you were like really passionate about creating this show, and you also agree it's good for business. We don't do any self-promoting really on the show at all. There's no like promotional, this is production of, or anything like that, other than on the website and our bios. But
no, I totally agree. The whole purpose behind creating it was to get a little bit of recognition and credibility, I think, within the industry for Podfly, my company as well. Because though I'd been producing podcasts for many, many years and we're running a successful company, I think that I found within some of the circles of the industry, a lot of people are like, well, you seem cool, but I don't know you. I've never heard your work. And I thought maybe I should have something that at least showcases my work because, even a lot of the people that are in our industry, they have their own shows. They have their own URL people point to and they download the show and they go, okay, I get this guy. He's got some skills. So I thought, initially that's the idea is I got to do something that's going to represent the skills of our production house or my skills as a producer as much as delve into the project as a passion project. So, there was very much a business decision as it was, just doing something that I think was going to be art.
Yeah. And I think the thing that Corey and I both have in common is we've both been behind the scenes people in podcasting. Like, I started my own podcast, 6-7 months ago, but really majority of the time that I've been kind of around this space, I've been behind the scenes, booking other people's guests, helping other people with their shows. Same thing with Corey. So I think this show was also an effort to, for Corey, absolutely to demonstrate our skills of, having great interviews, great guests and producing a great show, but also becoming thought leaders and authority figures in podcasting. Because when I kind of look at the podcasting space and, entrepreneurs with podcasters, there are those that really focus on having a big personal brand, a big following, big audience. I think Corey and I, majority of the time that we've had our businesses, have really been kind of behind the scenes and working with clients and building two pretty successful businesses in podcasting. And so this was kind of our chance to kind of get out from behind the curtain.
It sounds to me like a lot of the doubts were washed away pretty quickly then, because you each had complementary skills and started to really talk each other into it, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And, we set hard targets as well. I think, Jessica and I were amazed when we finally got to release that it really took us 2 months, to put it together, about 8 weeks from starting our first interview to actually releasing a product.
Wow.
And for us, that was kind of the thing. You really don't have time for doubt. You're just too busy getting this thing done. And I think that's a really great motivator. If we had not put a hard release date on this thing of April the 6th, then we'd still probably be editing it, arguing right now, and it might not have ever even gone out.
Yeah. And we talk about, we were really, really firm on that. We set a release date and, it was strategic. We wanted it out before, I think it was a week before New Media Expo, because we wanted a chance for people to listen to it before being at the conference where a lot of podcasters go. So there was strategy there. But I'm always talking about that to, just people in podcasting, my clients, like set a launch date and stick to it. And then, of course, Corey and I are listening to her like, oh, we should have changed that, or, oh, we could have changed that. But, we could have been, Corey could have been editing this show and adjusting, different things in the show for months. And we could have kept making it better. But honestly, from my perspective, any show is better to be out and being listened to than to be in production, being edited and edited and edited.
Yeah, it's funny because Jessica said to me as I'm working on it, as an editor, you kind of get inside your head. And you spend a lot of dark hours in a quiet room, working on all these things. And Jessica, you quoted, I think it was Zuckerberg or something, where you said, done is better than perfect. And I remember it's like, gosh, that really kind of upsets me because I want it to be perfect. But at the same time, it's like, you know what? It's better that it's just done, because those imperfections that you and I notice are not imperfections that, the majority of listeners are finding.
Yeah, that's true.
John Acuff, if you're familiar with him or not, he has a quote that's similar to that. It's something along the lines of 90% done and out there changes more lives than 100% done and perfect and in your head.
I love that.
So yeah, I kind of, and that's one of the things I'll ask people, well, then how do you get to that 90%? How do you figure out, okay, what's good enough for my standards and to put out there without nitpicking and holding on to it and trying to tweak it endlessly till it's perfect and perfection.
Well, and a funny thing happens because 99% of, 100% really of all the feedback that we've gotten has just been overwhelmingly positive and people love the show. But even people that love the show, like we still get comments or feedback like, oh, I heard, this little change, you guys should change this, or, oh, you should change this to your website, or, oh, you should make this change. It's really easy to criticize a show when you did not just spend like hours upon hours upon hours for just, a short amount of time putting it together. So regardless of how amazing it is, like you are always going to have people that, give you helpful critiques. And it's like, thank you for that unsolicited advice.
Those that didn't do the work are easiest to offer up their constructive criticism.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's great. Well, I listened through it all in essentially 2 sittings, literally, in my car. So it was always fun. I'll say this, Jessica, I want to echo back what Corey said about your interviewing style and skills, which is that when I remembered being interviewed by you for the show, and I remember thinking, man, she's asking awesome questions. This is a fun conversation to have about something I really like, podcasting. And then I had forgotten everything I'd said. And then, Corey, when you edit it together, like I'm just like, whoa, I just said something super profound. I can't believe I even knew to say that. So the combination really did pull off something that is greater than the sum of the parts, to be honest. So,
well, thank you. You were actually the first interview that I recorded for the show.
Oh, geez.
So
I'm glad I didn't know that at the time.
I definitely noticed too, because I remember commenting to you, Jessica, during the editing process, as well as interviews were coming in and I was starting to work at piecing them together, that your interview skills increased dramatically from one to the other. Because you really just got into a rhythm of doing it. It just became so natural.
Well, first, thank you so much for saying that. I really appreciate hearing that. And I feel the same way. Like, I feel like such a better podcaster and better interviewer after doing all those. I mean, I hear from YouTubers and even podcasters, they'll have challenges like do so many videos or do so many shows in a very short amount of time, because you just get so much better when you kind of, I don't know, binge podcast, Yeah, I do feel like I got better. And Corey really helped me with that too. Just little tips along the way. Like he would say, channel your, what do you say? Like channel your inner NPR personality.
Right.
The thing was, when we interviewed people, we didn't think it was just going to all, it wasn't going to be the Eric Fisher episode. We interviewed people about lots of different topics and then would take those pieces and their feedback and put them in the episodes where it made the most sense. So that allowed me to get on an interview and not feel like from the time I hit record to the time we hung up the phone that it had to be this perfect show, which is what I was used to. And what I do with my weekly podcast is like I hit record, do the intro, do the interview, do the do the close, and it's all one show. But with here, I didn't have to worry about like the perfect transitions or even phrasing questions perfectly, because I knew that sometimes Corey wouldn't actually put the way I asked the question on, he would put the person's answer. So it was a really interesting process.
And so let's touch on that for just a second. The idea for this, obviously you had the idea post Serial being a thing. However, I don't believe it was what convinced you to do this. In fact, I like that you actually touch on the Serial phenomenon in this series and even back it up with some Tom Webster, analytics, as to say that, you know what, Serial, yeah, it broadened the, I don't know, vernacular. More people knew the word podcast, but it didn't do some huge spike. Is that what I took that away? Is that what was true?
I can honestly admit, Eric, I have yet to listen to Serial. Honestly, I've never heard the show.
Well, there you go.
That was actually kind of an inner, when Corey brought this idea to me, a part of me was a little worried about what people would think because it was post Serial. And there was this, I know that Pat Flynn did at least one episode, Smart Passive Income, where he did the whole storytelling thing. And there was, kind of a lot of people saying like, oh, everyone's going to jump on the storytelling bandwagon. So I was a little bit afraid in my head what people would think. But before even vocalizing that fear, and I don't even think I said anything to Corey, I just thought, I don't care what people think, because there's always going to be critics. And ultimately, like we wanted to create a really great show. And I knew that Corey could handle that kind of production.
Well, and Serial's not a new thing. The serialized storytelling is not new as of Serial invented it. This American Life, which that came from, has been doing it for years, and the radio has been doing it for years.
Right.
NPR has been doing it for years. So the attention that it's gotten recently is, it's that the mainstream rediscovered podcasting. It's not that podcasting ever went away, right?
Right. Well, that's one of the whole radio migration conversation was one that I really, really enjoyed in the podcast producers, because in our community of podcasters and entrepreneurs and a lot of, interview-based podcasts, we are so passionate. Like, we are podcasters. We are in podcasting. We are not in radio. And what I really learned is that we are all creating audio content, whether it's radio, whether it's podcast, it's all audio content. It just depends on where you put it out there. I interviewed for the show Alex Goldman, who hosts Reply All, and he's worked in, at NPR for many years. And he kind of, said that because he was using radio and podcast interchangeably. And I'm like, well, okay, you're using both those terms. Well, what do you think about that? And he's like, it's all audio. I watch Netflix. That's TV. Or is it? Doesn't matter. I'm like, that is brilliant. Yeah, because Netflix is like the podcast of cable TV, but it's all the same type of entertainment. Whether you have it playing through the FM station on your car radio or whether you play it through your podcast app, it's all audio content that you're consuming. So I just thought that was just a really interesting way to look at it.
Yeah, I can't think of the article, but I read something a while back where it said Seinfeld is just Seinfeld. Seinfeld's not a TV show. It's not a DVD set. It's not something that might appear on Netflix someday. It's just Seinfeld. It's the medium. That's it.
Yeah, that's interesting. I know that Tom Webster and Mark Schaefer, I know you're familiar with Tom. Mm-hmm. They had a recent episode of a podcast they do together. I forget what it's called, but they were talking about this very thing, that whole name, the name of podcasting. And I think I even mentioned this at one point in the conversation we had earlier, Jessica, was this idea that the media moves on. It just keeps moving on. And radio is such a weird word in and of itself. Like, what the heck is a radio?
Yeah.
You know? And then there's TV, television, it's these weird words. And then blogging, weblog. What's a weblog? I don't know. And podcasts. I mean, all the words all stem from these original meanings that then become defunct in a sense. Right. Nobody carries around, I do, but nobody carries around iPods anymore. And yet the content or the media that crawls along, that is broadcasted out from those mediums, is still transforming, So that was one of those really interesting to me topics that you tackled. And in fact, how did you decide, okay, what do we need to cover? The history, the business versus hobby, all these different topics. How did you narrow that down?
Jessica and I, we just shared like a Google spreadsheet. And we just started brainstorming, laying down these kind of bigger overarching topics. And then she and I just took what we had in front of us and kind of rearranged them in a way that we thought would be a good story arc. And then from there, we just started filling out, who do we think are potentially interesting guests on each of these show topics? What are some of the questions that we might want to cover in it? And just kind of laid it all out that way. So it really just started with a lot of brainstorming, spitballing, throwing things at a wall, seeing what sticks, and then just continuing to rearrange everything that it looks like this might actually make logical sense to go from one to the other. But we always kept the constraint, Eric, and that was the point. Like we talked about having a constraining deadline. We also set the constraint of having only 10 shows. As tempting as it is, it's like, well, maybe we should do 12 because we don't cover this. It's like, no, everything's got to go into this box so that it comes out as a package.
I know that on the website you refer to it as season 1. So does that mean you have other topics you would like to explore and potentially do a round 2, a season 2?
I think so.
Yeah, I'm sure there is. The thing is, like when we started getting into these conversations, the funniest thing, Eric, was we would set aside what we'd expected to talk to a host about. And I think Jessica could speak to this really well too. We were thinking, okay, I'm going to talk to so-and-so about this particular topic and that topic because they are the authority in that field. But so often those conversations, because they were so natural, would stray into the other topics, into the other shows that we would go, oh my gosh. At first it's a little discouraging because it's like, I didn't get the content that I was hoping for that person. However, that's so valid in these other episodes that I think Jessica and I both found that it's like there's so many other areas that we could go into. We could do a little deeper dive and drill more down into some of these topics, and spawn a season 2.
Yeah, the workflow is really interesting. So Corey mentioned we just hopped on Skype together, had the Google spreadsheet open, talked about all the different topics we wanted to cover, came up with an order for it, and then just went down the list and just started spitballing all these different names of people we thought of. At first we would think a lot of like kind of the big names. And then I would say, all right, well, let's, we want to have some well-known people and some big names, but we also really wanted to make sure that we were highlighting podcasters that weren't necessarily just the big hitters. Like, for example, we didn't reach out to John Lee Dumas to have him on the show, not because we don't like John, but he's out there in podcasting. And we just wanted to really kind of give the spotlight on the large podcasting community. So we went through and just thought of all these people we know, like when we were talking about, making podcasting your business. I said, well, I work with Katie Kremitzos, host of Biz Women Rock, and she is creating Biz Women Rock as a business. And so we focused on that topic with her. At first, we were like, oh, John Lee Dumas. We're like, well, let's focus on maybe somebody who's kind of been trained by John Lee Dumas. So we kind of thought about different people for different topics. So after we came up with all the different guest ideas, then I reached out and I did all the bookings. And then Corey and I just divided and conquered. We said, I'll interview this person. I'll interview this person. Sometimes like I knew the person, but we wanted it to be more of like a male-female interview. So we had, Corey interview Katie, and then I interviewed some people that I didn't know that Corey thought of. And then for like the next 2 or 3 weeks, we just divided and conquered. We were just interviewing like every day. There was one week where I think I did like 10 interviews that week. Mm-hmm. And then once we kind of finished all the interviews, that's when we kind of came back. And then Corey went into the editing room and kind of put it all together. So it was an intense 2 months.
Wow. Corey, how did you approach that next, what we would consider post-production in the podcast, or I guess all mediums?
In the audio medium.
In the audio mediums, post-production can be a hang-up for a lot of people. They're saying, well, I've recorded a bunch of interviews, but I've got to go through and process them all. And, I don't have a virtual assistant to help me with that. You did this. Like, you took what you guys had at that point and then started to cut and stitch together the narrative with all these lengthy audio clips. How did you do that?
Well, it's easier for me, Eric, because it's what I do all day, right? It's what my company does. It's what my team does. It's what I love to do. And I knew when I talked to Jessica, it's like, I want this podcast to kind of be the dark side of the moon of podcasts, where people like turn down the lights and crank up the stereo and listen to this thing, So for me, I always kind of had that idea that I'm really doing a record. I'm creating an artistic piece that can be presented as a whole. So for me, I was excited to dive into it. The process itself was really straightforward. I set up what I considered editing bins. So I created basically 10 folders that were each of the show topics. And I just went minute through minute and listened to all the interviews. When something came out of that interview that was appropriate for one of those bins that represented the show, I clipped it out and put it in the bin. And then it was a matter of going through each of those bins and then start layering them out in order to start telling a story within that episode. So some bins, for example, would maybe only have 4 or 5 interviews because I remember, for example, the network show, Daniel J. Lewis had so much great information. We maybe only had 4 or 5 personalities on that one. Whereas on episode 1, everyone had a little bit to say about what is a podcast. So in that particular bin, there was maybe 15 or 20 different guests. And also we had to be careful to make sure that we laid it out in a way that there wasn't confusion on the part of the listener. Jessica and I know the voice and who we're talking to, but we needed to make sure that there was a way that the listener was introduced to each of those people so that they weren't going, well, wait a minute, who's this person talking now? And who's this person talking? So that was kind of difficult. We really did it in a series of stages. The first being laying out the story arc in terms of having each of these guests in positions in the episode that we thought might be appropriate. The second part is then going back, and Jessica and I each did independent narrations of maybe 15 or 20 minutes that were just on the topic, just kind of a brain dump monologue. So I had all these big pieces that I could move around and place interspersed amongst the interview clips. Then the third stage is going back with that and doing narration so that we can introduce those guests or we can link those pieces together. And then the fourth layer on top of that was using some great music that was provided by Anthony Weiss to really smooth out all the edges and then make it this kind of cohesive experience, this really pleasurable listening experience for everyone.
Man, that's interesting. Even coming from somebody who does post-production on a podcast, almost weekly, I feel a little bit mind blown listening to that whole process. And in a sense, though, feel like, wow, that's actually something within the grasp of more people than maybe they realize. And again, I'm not saying, hey, everybody go out and start doing serialized podcasts. However, I think it's one of those things that podcasts have not had enough of in terms of telling stories in that format from the large budgeted studio type podcasts.
Yeah, well, I mean, from a production standpoint, it's easier to do just a linear show.
Yeah.
Where I'm going to do an intro, a little bit of an interview, and then maybe some sort of call to action at the end, which is 90% of the podcasters out there. And that makes sense. It's a super efficient way to get a lot of content out there. But I think when Jessica and I were talking, we had a lot of back and forth on Skype during and before interviews, those kind of tense moments before you get somebody on. And I think we just kept saying, remember that they're the ones telling the story. It's not us telling the story. Mm-hmm. Allow them to speak. Allow them to tell their position. And then we can go back and then we can put our interpretation around that as a frame.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I remember many of those because we interviewed, for me, I got on Skype with some people that I, felt a little starstruck by. For me, the biggest person was Alex Goldman, who works at Gimlet Media and hosts Reply All. I was like, oh, I remember, Skyping Corey. Oh my gosh, I'm about to interview, Alex Goldman, like a super nice guy. And I think that really was the key in that. Yeah. So at the beginning of creating the show, we're like, okay, this needs to make sense for our businesses and all that good stuff. But when we got into producing it, it was never about what we do, who we are. Like, we weren't the experts. We really wanted to give the platform to the guest. And our job as interviewers was to allow them to share their story, to share their expertise, to share their thoughts on all these different topics. And that, I think, was the key in allowing for a beautiful story. And then because we had that mindset in the interview, one of the parts that Corey kind of mentioned, but Corey and I then did 2 weeks every day at 2:00. Corey and I got on Skype and just had conversations with each other about the different topics. So in the show, there are solo pieces where Corey and I, we'd each record our, monologues about that topic. Then there were interviews that we put in, and then there were conversations between me and Corey, which I really wanted to get some of those raw episodes out because there were some hilarious conversations. I mean, there were times, certain topics like with the advertising episode and networks, those were two episodes where I don't have as much experience with advertising, and I didn't know really what to say about networks either. They were just two newer topics. So Corey would say something totally profound, and I'm like, I don't know what to say in response, Corey. Please edit this out.
I forgot about that too. And there was such a nice rapport between you and I, which is, I think, for a lot of podcasters, kind of that it can be a pain point, is getting the back and forth between yourself and your co-host. I don't know. There has to be that sort of symbiosis and simpatico. And I think, Jessica and I sit on two kind of sides of the same camp in a lot of regards in terms of some of these topics that we covered. Jessica's very business focused. I'm very art focused. And I think that really came through. And, I'm interested to see, I'd love to actually go back and listen through some of those conversations that Jessica and I had, because they were really good. There was a neat flow to it. And I think it was super revealing in terms of just our perspective at that time. And more importantly, it was very revealing to our personalities, which I don't think we utilized the podcast again to do. I don't think it was really to demonstrate who we are as people.
Yeah. And that's something that I definitely, just going back to kind of our complementary personalities. Yeah, I'm definitely more business focused, and Corey is definitely more art focused. And, there were times where I had some ideas about certain things, and he's like, no, I really don't want it to be like that. And some of us like, come on, like, I want to, let's get an opt-in out there and let's build our list. And we didn't really, we have an opt-in where it's like, join our list. And I don't know, Corey, how many people have joined that? Probably
none,
really,
because that's not what we're about.
Because we didn't,
I'll never forget the first one, which was, hey, what we should do is do like an opt-in with a free report. I'm like, barf.
Yeah.
Oh my.
Yeah. Because that was
it.
In my head, I'm like, I want to build my list and I want to quickly get people knowing who I am. But Corey really pushed against that. And at first I'm like, there were times where I'm like, God, really, Corey? Come on. Like, we're in business, Well,
but yeah, I have two questions here, and we'll come back to the marketing piece of it. That's one I really want to talk a little bit more about. But I'm curious to see, how did those conversations that the two of you had through the process of creating it, and, you've already picked your topics, you've already picked who's going to speak to what topics, but how did those conversations you then had after doing some of those interviews, how did the project itself adapt as you moved forward?
Corey, do you want to take that one?
Yeah. It was funny. I think there were a couple conversations that Jessica and I were taping between her and I that we felt we're trying to retell the story that our guest told. And it's funny because when her and I were speaking, we might not have had time to hear the interview that we had just conducted with somebody else. So it was great because it worked out that her and I were talking about what some of the guests were saying. So even when her and I were talking to each other, it still became very guest centric. But we also, I think, just hit stop a couple times and said, you know what? I don't really have anything more to say about this. Yeah. It's so well covered by the guest. I don't want to pollute it with our opinions.
Okay. So, I really respect that. Like, you guys stayed focused the whole time and just said, the story is about podcasting and the guests are the ones that are telling it.
Yeah, exactly. And with Corey, just kind of one more thought about Corey really kind of getting the business out of me throughout this process. I think one of the overarching kind of lessons and themes of the show was focus on producing really good content. First and foremost, in a podcast, in producing radio, focus on really, really good content, and kind of the marketing and exposure and all that good stuff kind of follows naturally. And I kind of went into it originally thinking like, all right, I'm going to think about the marketing of it. This is going to be great for business. We're going to promote our businesses. And Corey's like, no, I don't want to really even say our business name on the show. I'm like, you crazy? Like, but it was actually a really, really good decision. I mean, I'm obviously, like we said, who we are kind of in the show, but it was a really good decision because the effects of it are kind of people are really being attracted to the content and being impressed by that first, rather than seeing a marketing aspect to it.
And
so Corey was right.
I was going to say, coming back around. So coming back around to the marketing of this serialized story in audio format. Man, that's a lot of words. We got to think of better ways to talk about this stuff sometimes. The piece of work, the art, the story, standing alone on its own, standing tall on its own, I guess is best way to put it, is create good stuff, and that itself will market itself in a way. Is that kind of what you were going for? I mean, not you, Jessica, but Corey.
Okay.
Eric, it's funny because I work so much on the front end of creating content that I'm less and less interested on the secondary stage, and that's the marketing aspect of it. There's people who are experts at it. They're really good in that field, and I let them to it because honestly, marketing to me is just kind of black magic, voodoo, rubber chicken, dance around the room and something happens. I don't understand it. For me, it always had been about, let's just create something that other people will naturally talk about. If they like it, they will share it with other people. And that's all there is to it for me. I know there's probably a marketing strategy that should be employed. And Jessica and I have talked about now that we're going into June, we're going to go ahead and push things out a little bit more and remind people that this thing is out there because I think there were a lot of people who didn't get to it back in April. But at the end of the day, it really just came down to, I felt like especially a lot of the guests who participated in the program, they believed in it enough to start marketing it out to their channels. I know that's kind of a technique a lot of podcasters use. It's like, well, I'll get this high profile guest and he or she will share it with their massive audience. And then we, ergo, will get all these subscribers. I've seen that being pretty limited in its effectiveness. But I think it's a little different here, though, because, just such as you, Eric, it's like you actually listen to the show, you enjoy it, and now you're willing to maybe promote it out to people because you believe in the product. And that's what we found. I think, Jessica, when I talked to a lot of people in Las Vegas who had just listened to the show, they said, oh my gosh, I just binged listened to all 10 episodes of this. What can I do to help you to let other people know about this? And I said, just, post it out there, let people know, just point to it. So that's...
Yeah.
Go ahead.
The marketing conversation is interesting because quite frankly, we could do a lot more in marketing this show. And to be really honest with you, we have a Google document, I think called Marketing Plan, and it currently is empty.
We have a document?
I said, because, as we were finishing up, we finished all the interviews, Corey's in editing. I'm like, okay, I'm going to create a marketing plan. And I didn't. So we created a lot of graphics. We created a graphic for each guest. So each guest had a, graphic with their photo on it. And we went through got a number of quotes and kind of created some graphics and put them out on social media. But it's funny, actually, I put out a video today about interviewing guests because they have a large following, because a lot of podcasters do that. They only want to interview people because they have a large following. And yes, we booked some guests with that are big names, but it was around the content. We never booked some of these big guests because we thought they would share it. That was never the thought process. In fact, some of the people that are sharing it the most are listeners who weren't on the show, who just genuinely really like it. For us, the marketing has been so far, we share it and promote it. I, have in my newsletter. It's something that we point to as a resource when people ask questions. But I don't know about you, Corey. I don't think we did any Facebook ads. I mean, there was really nothing like super marketing or strategic in the promotion of it. We just kind of put it out there and we do. I mean, I traveled a whole lot this spring, after we put it out there. So we keep saying, all right, we got to get together and see what we can do to kind of promote it more and market it. But our focus was so much on creating the show that there was no Twitter strategy. There was no Facebook strategy. It was just, let's create an amazing show, put it out there, share it and all that good stuff, build relationships with our listeners and the guests and see what happens. And I know there's so much more we could do, but that's kind of where we're at the game right now.
Yeah, and we kind of built a little bit, ahead of launch and after launch. I think we really just kind of inundated Facebook and Twitter with everything during that 2-week period. And there's a point where I felt like just personally, I got to back off this a little bit now because you just feel like, well, this is getting a little self-bloviating.
Yeah. And we want it to be a show that's long-term. So we purposefully didn't want to, inundate our social media followings and our list with this show in the first couple of weeks because, I think we got some new and noteworthy love, but it wasn't about the high rankings on iTunes right away because we want this to be a show that people listen to and can use as a resource for years to come. So we weren't really worried about this huge marketing push at launch. Yeah. We launched it, but we didn't really talk about a launch plan.
It's not really a going concern. It's a book on a shelf.
Yeah. If you create a bestseller, no, let's change that word. Let's not say bestseller. Let's say if you create a really good book, it will consistently sell for a very long time.
Right.
And eventually you see it start to hockey puck or not puck, hockey stick where it goes up. That's awesome. So yeah, you guys finished basically. I mean, you're done. I mean, it's done. It's out there for about a month now, a little over a month and a half.
Yeah.
And what's the next part of the project? Again, season 2 is something you're feeling the need and desire to do, but how soon do you move on to moving into doing that? Oh, well, especially with new kids coming into.
Yeah, that's what I told Corey. I'm like, we waited till it was out. We said, let's not decide. We called it season 1, not knowing if we were going to do a season 2, but we said, let's see what the response is. If there's a really positive response, if people really like it, if we don't hate each other at the end of this, then we'll do a season 2. But I did say, even at that point, like, it can't happen until late 2015 or early 2016 because I'm having a baby in August, and it's just, can't kind of take on a whole project like this again. But we are talking about some things for the summer. I don't know, well, Corey, what do you want to share?
I don't mind teasing it a little bit because, as we were just talking about earlier, there were a lot of interviews in long form that were really fascinating and really fun. So we've been discussing releasing some of those interviews just in long format, just raw, unedited interviews available. So kind of, people who want to do, again, that drill down a little bit deeper into those conversations and just have, hey, here's the whole 30-minute call that we had with Eric Fisher, making those available kind of in the meantime to keep people's whistles wet.
Yeah. So we're talking about, kind of like season 1 uncut maybe and there were some interviews that, we only used a few minutes of, a lot was left on the cutting room floor, and they're quite entertaining actually, because I mentioned we didn't, hit record and treat it as a whole show. I mean, I remember when I interviewed Mary and Blake Larson, who they host a few different podcasts, a couple entertainment shows, a parenting show, and, we're friends. They live locally. We both have kids the same age. And I remember like at the end of the interview, gosh, it's 8:30 at night. I got to go eat my bagel for dinner. Like there's funny stuff like that I think people would like because they'll sound good, but they wouldn't be super polished. Like we both look like perfect podcasters,
Yeah, and I think a lot of people are asking about the behind the scenes stuff. They want to know what went into making this show, and it's super revealing if they can hear the raw, unedited interviews. They can go, wow, okay, I see how they kind of maybe took this and turned it into that. So I think there's a small number of people that might be interested in hearing that kind of stuff. It's the extended version of the DVD with, all of the extra features on there. I think there's some folks that would love it because they're all podcast producers themselves. So they they geek out on this stuff too.
Yeah. And we even had friends say like, oh, you could sell this whole thing. Or we even, even said, maybe we'll, I know, right? Not even me. I didn't even want it to be something that we sold. But there was a time we're like, oh, maybe we could use the raw interviews as a list builder. I'm like, no, let's just put it out there let's just put it out there. Let's just have people listen to it and enjoy it and just kind of have it be a new type of show. And I think that we would follow the same model, like, sometime in the middle of the summer, just put out 10 more raw interviews just to kind of give people their podcast producers fix.
Yeah. Well, I hope that this episode right here becomes a little bit of a taste for what's to come. And since you guys won't be looking to build your lists and people will know.
People can join our individual lists.
There you go. That's what I'm saying. Like, that's what I'm saying here as we close here. People should go check out thepodcastproducers.com, but also you two should tell people where to find each other individually.
Corey, it's okay to do it now. You can share.
Now's the time.
Granted. Yes, this is the appropriate place to
Corey, you
market
can go
yourself briefly.
You can just go to podfly.net, and that's my production company. And there's also links out to the podcast producers there as well. So that's probably the easiest way to find me. Or you know what? If you just Google my name, Corey Coates, all my other stuff pops up.
Don't Google my name because you'll find a bunch of porn stars named Jessica Rhodes. But if you go to my home base, my blog is Jessica Rhodes. That's Rhodes, jessicarhodes.biz. There are links to everything else from there. My business is at interviewconnections.com if you want to check out what I do in my business. But yeah, jessicarhodes.biz, and you'll see links to everything else from there.
Awesome. Guys, this has been fun for me, and that's what a good show should be. So thanks for being on the show.
Thanks so much for having us. This was really a lot of fun. This was the first time Corey and I got back on a podcast together since making the show. So this was awesome.
Nice.
Yay.
As a listener of podcasts, I really hope you enjoyed this episode. You owe it to yourself also as a listener of podcasts and a fan of podcasts to go check out The Podcast Producers. And you can easily find that over at thepodcastproducers.com. Make sure to let Jessica and Corey know if you enjoyed this episode and the work that they put into the Podcast Producers Project. If you're interested in getting started with better audio editing, don't forget my recommendations this week for lynda.com courses are to go check out and type in the word Audacity, go check out and type in GarageBand and Adobe Audition. Those are the 3 different podcast editing tools that I've used. I know there's actually even more in there, like Logic, Pro Tools, Logic, whatever. They're in there. You can get whatever your podcast editing tool of choice is, and maybe you've not figured that out yet. Maybe that's what you need to do, is go in there and figure out which of your tools is the one that you need to choose. You can get a great overview and expert walkthrough of which tools to use and why. So help support this show and help support yourself by going to lynda.com/TODO and get that free trial from lynda.com. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you next episode. Beyond the To-Do List is a proud member of the Noodle.mx Network. Find more of our award-winning and award-nominated podcasts to make you think, laugh, and succeed at Noodle.mx. Learn how to podcast. Theorize over the TV shows Once Upon a Time in Wonderland, and Under the Dome. Laugh with our clean comedy. Delve into science fiction and philosophy. Learn critical thinking from movie reviews. And more at Noodle.mx.